Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thanks to each of you for joining us today. My name is Kate Oren. I'm Senior Gender Program Manager with the International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN, and it's my pleasure to welcome each of you today. Before we get started, next slide, please. Please know that today's discussion will be live in both English and Spanish, and so we have simultaneous translation provided in English, Spanish, and French. To listen to this webinar in your preferred language live, please go ahead and download the app Interactio from the Apple Store or Google Play Store. When you open that, you're going to need to enter the code GBV-env, as you see on the screen here. It's usually most convenient to listen to the live translation on another device, through headphones on your phone, for example, if you can. If not, that's fine on your screen. Just remember to mute this live meeting so that you hear the voice of the translator clearly. And I will take this moment to thank you very much, translation team behind the scenes. The registration email that you received also has these instructions for the translation. Feel free to access that. I'm also going to show you a quick demo video in just a second here. And if you have any questions, please feel free to chat to the team behind the scenes in the chat box in the control panel, probably on the right-hand side of your screen. So next, we're going to show just a quick video to how to access this live translation. And there we have it. So if you're just joining on, signing on now, a warm welcome to each of you, and thanks for being here again. I think we're all accustomed to virtual sessions by now, but just a few important virtual housekeeping matters here to get organized and kick things off. First, please do be aware that this session is being recorded, and it will be available in all 3 languages on our agent webpage, which we'll send through after the session. Microphones will all be kept in the mute mode. This is just to minimize connectivity issues and distractions, but please consider your active participation warmly encouraged. You can use the chat box or the questions functions to send your comments and questions as they occur to you. We'll be collecting them behind the scenes, organizing them so that we can try to get through as many as we can in the Q&A. If you have any questions at all, please do feel free to reach out to the team. A big thanks to the team behind the scenes, including USAID, our organizer, who makes this session and all the sessions in our series possible. I also want to thank the speakers and collaborating organizations on this session. And finally, please note that there are some handouts, some recommended reading and resources, hyperlinks. They're available for you in the handouts section of the control panel. Before we continue into substance, please do be aware that this session will discuss gender-based violence, including various forms and expressions of violence, which we understand may be uncomfortable, upsetting, and triggering for some. Here in this webinar series, we do aim to make a safe space to discuss these challenging topics that pervade our societies and limit our collective work. But we do encourage you, the participant and listener, to please take care. Now, before we go on, we would be grateful if you would respond to just a quick, simple question. We'd like to know how you would personally rate your own knowledge right now coming into this session on gender-based violence and climate change linkages. So we're going to show a poll in just a second, and if you could please select on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is you feel brand new at understanding the nexus of these issues, to 5 being very knowledgeable and a resource for others. We're going to keep this open for just 30 seconds or so. If you've joined our webinars before, you know that we regularly collect this information to ensure that these convenings are useful and to make adjustments and inform future webinar sessions. We'll keep this open for just another couple of seconds. Okay, great. Thank you so much, everybody. This is a great mixed audience, and we're grateful that you're here. Thank you so much. Today's webinar is part of a series that aims to build awareness, learn about challenges as well as strategies, tools, and promising practice from across sectors, and to engage each other in community to better understand and address gender-based violence and environment linkages. We organize these webinars, next slide please, for learning and mobilizing community in action under our Gender-Based Violence and Environment Linkages Center, which is hosted by IUCN with support and collaboration from USAID through our partnership called Agent, Advancing Gender in the Environment. As shown on this infographic here on the right of your screen, the center was born out of a 2.5-year research to practice process and is now dedicated to centering attention to build and promote cross-sector knowledge, resources and tools, strategies and technical support to very diverse projects around the globe, advocacy and cooperation to try to better understand and address gender-based violence across environmental contexts, forging collaborative action towards ending GBV and securing a safe, just, and healthy planet. Today's session focuses on what we know about gender-based violence in a changing climate, one of the most prominent themes in our own research and work, and a topic we regularly receive many questions about. Through our agenda today, we aim to share information from across sectors, building a common understanding of how gender-based violence intersects with a changing climate and vice versa. We'll also have the opportunity to learn from our speakers that have been working on this sector across sectors for many years in different roles and capacities, from international and national policy setting to development and environment programming, academia, and at most grassroots level. Our agenda today includes incredible speakers and leaders working across sectors and across regions of the world. It's my pleasure to facilitate the very start of this webinar, and then Dr. Julia Bradley Cook, Climate Change Advisor for USAID's Africa Bureau, will moderate what I know will be a rich discussion with our panelists after we hear a short presentation from my colleague, Itza Castañeda, who will offer some insight into some of the connective tissue between these issues, an overview of linkages between GBV and environment in a changing climate. In particular, she'll focus on the evidence that we've gathered and analyzed as part of our own research process. But first, it is my great pleasure to pass the floor for opening remarks to my friend, Vandana Rana, someone who has been at the forefront of both movements to eradicate gender-based violence and to address climate change as matters of twinned urgency. By way of very brief biography for a very rich life, Vandana is one of the key leaders of the women's movement in Nepal and across the globe. Her experience spans 3 decades promoting women's rights and gender equality through different organizations and networks that she has founded and led. Working from grassroots to national, regional, and global levels, she's developed and led programs for combating gender-based violence, harmful practices against women and girls, and for women, peace, and security. She has extensive experience in leading advocacy efforts linked to all sorts of UN processes and frameworks, including provided for by CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. She's also been active in the International Conference on Population and Development Processes, the Beijing Platform for Action, and the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security. As a broadcast journalist for 2 decades, Vandana led communication and media programs for addressing gender stereotypes and changing mindsets, skills she also employs in countless dialogues between government entities and women's organizations, strengthening coherence and partnership. Recipient of many awards and honors, she was a member of the UN Secretary General's High-Level Advisory Group for the Global Study on the Implementation of Resolution 1325, and a member of the UN Women Global Civil Society Advisory Group. She's currently a member of the CEDAW Committee, among many other distinctions. Vandana, we're so lucky to have this time with you, not least in this incredibly important year for environmental decision-making and gender equality processes and decision-making. While still here today in the midst of the International Women's Month, the UN Commission on the Status of Women meetings, the run-up to Generation Equality Forum, and so much more. And with sincere thanks, I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kate. I'm very humbled with that introduction. Very, very warm greetings from Nepal. As Kate said, I'm a lifelong passionate advocate for gender equality. The link to climate change has come afterwards, and I feel a very important linkage. And today, particularly, as a member of the CEDAW committee, I will be speaking and sharing with you what the CEDAW committee has done on what kind of importance and focus it provides on the linkages between gender-based violence in a changing climate. All of you may know CEDAW is a United Nations Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and it's a legally binding framework. So it is a powerful mechanism through which we can hold member states accountable, governments accountable. Now, in terms of climate change, because CEDAW looks at a whole range of women's rights and the discrimination that women suffer, it believes in substantive equality, non-discrimination, and state obligation. These are the three principles of CEDAW. In terms of climate change, because the CEDAW committee realized the importance of climate change and its link with gender-based violence, it came up with a general recommendation in 2018. It's called the GR37 on gender-related dimension on disaster risk reduction in the context of climate change. Why does the CEDAW committee adopt a general recommendation? Because it realizes that the state parties require detailed instructions as to how discrimination against women can be mitigated and what is, and if there's a certain aspect that needs to be covered, addressed to instruct state parties, it does that. So because of the importance, the realization of the importance of gender-based violence and climate change, CEDAW adopted General Recommendation 37, as I said earlier, on gender-related dimension on disaster risk reduction in the context of climate change. It has highlighted, in this general recommendation, it has highlighted a number of issues that I just want to share over here. One, it's the recognition of heightened risks for women and girls of gender-based violence during and following disasters. In the absence of social protection schemes and in situations where there is food insecurity, coupled with impunity for gender-based violence, women and girls are often exposed to sexual violence and exploitation as they attempt to access food and other basic needs for family members and themselves. The committee has also observed on different occasions that sexual violence is common in humanitarian crisis and may become acute in the wake of a national disaster. The other issue that it recognizes is barriers, issues of accessibility and violations in camps and temporary settlements due to the lack of physical security, as well as the lack of safe and accessible infrastructures, including drinking water and sanitation. Women and girls with disabilities are at particular risk of gender-based violence during such disasters. Domestic violence, early and or forced marriage, human trafficking, and forced prostitution are also more likely to occur during and following disasters. The other section that it highlights is the intersectional vulnerabilities, the vulnerability and exposure of women and girls to disaster risk and climate change are economically, socially, and culturally constructed and can be reduced. For example, women migrants face a heightened risk of gender-based violence, including human trafficking and other forms of discrimination in transit, in camps, at borders, and in destination countries. The other highlight is about the importance of participation. The categorization of women and girls as passive, vulnerable groups in need of protection from the impact of disasters is a negative gender stereotype that fails to recognize the important contributions to disaster risk reduction, post-disaster management, and climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies. So in consideration of these recognitions, the GR37 calls on state parties to develop policies and programs to address existing and new risk factors for gender-based violence against women, including domestic violence, sexual violence, economic violence, human trafficking, and forced marriage. It also calls on parties to ensure that the minimum legal age for marriage is 18 years for both women and men. This is because there are numerous child marriages taking place during and post-disasters. Provide accessible, confidential, supportive, and effective mechanisms for all women wishing to report gender-based violence. Develop in partnership with stakeholders a system of regular monitoring and evaluations. Provide training, sensitization, and awareness raising for authorities, emergency services workers, and other groups. And also adopt long-term policies and strategies to address the root causes of gender-based violence against women in disasters, including by engaging with men and boys, the media, traditional and religious leaders, and educational institutions. I would now like to highlight at least a few examples of how the CEDAW committee, based on this general recommendation, has in the recent constructive dialogues, what kind of recommendations has it provided to different state parties? And I have just picked a few randomly. There's no particular basis for the choice that I have made. So it's Eritrea I've taken here, 2020. This was in early 2020 in our February session. The committee recommended that the state party ensure that women are meaningfully involved in the development of legislation, policies, and programs on climate change, disaster response, and disaster risk reduction. For Seychelles in 2019, integrate a gender perspective. There are more, but I'm just picking a few. Integrate a gender perspective into national policies and programs on climate change that reflects the needs and concerns of women. Cambodia 2019, ensure the effective participation of women in the formulation and implementation of policies and action plans on climate change, particularly taking into account the needs of women in rural areas. Cabo Verde 2019, ensure that women are meaningfully involved in the development of legislation, national policies, and programs, and also take measures to address hunger and ensure food security for rural women. Guyana 2019, review its climate change and energy policies, particularly those relating to the extraction of oil and gas. Mozambique 2019, ensure a gender perspective is integrated into the development and implementation of policies and programs on disaster risk reduction and climate change. Also conduct assessment studies. There are several over here. I just took a few. I don't think I have much time. The last one I would like to take is Samoa in 2018. Strengthen gender analysis and mainstream the concerns and rights of women by ensuring their participation in decision-making with regard to policy development and the implementation of disaster prevention and management programs, in particular those relating to climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. These are just some examples of
Ce sont des exemples où le comité, dans les années récentes, a entrepris et souligné les liens entre la violence basée sur le genre dans un climat changeant. Et j'aimerais encore les organisations, et je apprécie le travail fait par l'IUCN, et j'ai été engagé là-dedans parfois, mais une prise de conscience le plaidoyer entrepris et les partenariats avec les organisations des femmes, mais j'aimerais dire que peu importe comment vos plans du plaidoyer, de vos programmes sont, à moins que les gouvernements au niveau national s'engagent, cela ne va pas marcher. Et la manière la plus efficace de renforcer la redevabilité des gouvernements, c'est-à-dire ces mécanismes de la CEDEF et les mécanismes y afférents en fournissant, si un pays fait des rapports au comité de la CEDEF, l'IUCN devrait examiner qu'est-ce qui se passe dans ces pays en termes de violence basée sur le genre et la violence, pour faire en sorte que le comité de la CEDEF peut poser des questions au gouvernement et inclure des recommandations spécifiques à cette partie étatique dont ces recommandations est basée sur ces recommandations. La société civile peut renforcer le plaidoyer au niveau national pour une redevabilité accrue. Je pense en tant qu'activiste, j'ai utilisé la CEDEF avant même de faire partie du comité pour faire partie des changements de politique. Mais je sais que ça marche, donc je sais que vous allez entreprendre des discussions maintenant, mais je vous encourage à avoir des synergies renforcées, un engagement accru avec les mécanismes de la CEDEF pour renforcer la redevabilité, avoir plus de liens entre la violence basée sur le genre dans un climat qui change. Merci beaucoup, Bandana. Cela était extraordinaire comme introduction. Je pense que vous avez donné aux membres du panel beaucoup à prendre en compte et dont leurs remarques. Bien sûr, les résolutions faites sous le comité de la CEDEF sont parmi les documents les plus importants sur les liens entre la violence basée sur le genre et le changement climatique et peuvent être utilisés comme référence pour des gouvernements, des parties prenantes comme outil, comme vous avez si bien dit, et je vous en remercie encore une fois. Vous avez besoin de partir maintenant, mais on vous remercie pour votre temps. Merci, Bandana. Donc maintenant, je vais présenter nos orateurs suivants. Mon collègue Ita Katanede est conseillère principale en matière de genre et d'environnement au sein de notre équipe et l'un des principaux auteurs de la publication de la science sur les liens entre la violence basée sur le genre et l'environnement, élaborée avec le soutien de USAID. Pendant les 10 prochaines minutes, elle donnera un aperçu des questions clés, y compris les résultats de notre propre recherche, le travail qu'on est en train de faire maintenant, mais suite à ça, et n'oubliez pas, bien sûr, tout le monde, de partager vos commentaires, vos questions, vos commentaires dans le chat, dans le de contrôle. Après cela, on va tourner directement à Julia qui va rentrer dans la partie discussion de ce webinaire. Le Dr Bradley Cook fournit un leadership éclairé, un soutien technique et une gestion de programme pour les programmes de l'USAID en Afrique subsaharienne. Son portefeuille comprend l'agriculture intelligente face au climat, les paysages durables, l'adaptation au climat et les ressources naturelles. Avant de se rejoindre à USAID, elle a géré sur le changement climatique au Sénat américain, dans le milieu universitaire et dans les ONG. Elle va présider notre panel de discussion tout d'abord, mais avant, je vais vous passer la parole, Itza. Merci beaucoup. Merci, Kate. Bonjour tout le monde. Buenos dias. Bonjour. Donc aujourd'hui, je vais présenter les résultats clés de la recherche sur la violence basée sur le...
Specifically those related to climate change. During our research process, climate change was one of the most cited issues in cases that we received to our call for case studies and survey responses. It is the most prominent issue in media coverage of the publication and in requests coming from support from across sectors and levels of work. Climate change touches on every environmental sector, and the webinar series dives into many of these areas. But today, this presentation provides just an overview of what we already know. Climate change exacerbates stress insecurity, and safety, which contributes to an increase in gender-based violence. Next, Laura, please. What we know about gender-based violence. It is important to set this, to introduce this as a common floor for this webinar. Gender-based violence is any harm or potential of harm perpetrated on the basis of gender. It is a symptom and a tool of gender inequality and human rights violation. It has been widely documented that gender-based violence is the result of a long-standing, deeply entrenched discriminatory norms that treat gender inequality with permissibility and further embed this inequality within societal structures and institutions. We also know that structural and sociocultural inequalities that systematically restrict individuals' ability to realize the full spectrum of their rights reinforce vulnerability and can result in violent acts to uphold gender power dynamics. In the context of climate change, it is fundamental not to consider men and women as an homogeneous groups. This can reinforce harmful stereotypes that can perpetrate economic, social, or political inequalities and fail to recognize the challenges that different groups face with multiple layers of marginalization. So understanding gender-based violence and climate change interlinkages is critical for effective policymaking, planning, and interventions as these issues influence one another in various ways, as we will see during this webinar. And we have already seen with Bandana's a presentation that can hinder or negate progress. Thank you, please, Laura. So when we, at IUCN, we have been working on these issues for more than 3 years, and we have found different conditions that worsen gender-based violence. Some of them are the following. Climate change and weather-related disasters degrade natural resources, disrupt food production and water availability, damage infrastructure, and hinder progress of the full realization of human rights and poverty eradication. This is important. This is a matter of human rights and impacts poverty eradication. The breakdown of economic systems, infrastructure, and social services during times of climatic stress and weather-related disaster can heighten tensions within homes and communities and exacerbate gender inequalities, including the proliferation of various forms of gender-based violence. Bandana was telling us the various forms that gender-based violence, I'm not going to repeat it, but it is important to consider that it's not only one way, that gender-based violence has many different types and forms. We already know that gender-based violence escalates in disaster situations. We know this from the humanitarian response and trusted strategies and interventions. But in relation to climate change, we have found that increased rates of domestic and intimate partner violence have been documented across regions in the aftermath of disasters. For example, after 2 tropical cyclones in Vanuatu, there was an increase of intimate partner violence of 300%. 300%. Climate change is also rolling back decades of efforts in the elimination of child marriage. Increased rates of child marriage have been documented in disaster-prone regions such as Bangladesh, where more frequent and extreme floods are forcing many families to marry their daughters at a younger age. Climate change can also increase the incidence of sexual exploitation and human trafficking. For example, the Heightened typhoon, which devastated Thailand, led to an increase of trafficking rates in the region. When these events happen, moving to temporary housing and emergency shelters may be necessary, but also this poses a risk for women and girls, as an increased number of gender-based violence cases are reported in these settings. Finally, climate-driven migration and displacement due to climate-related events can also foster conditions for increased incidence of gender-based violence, including human trafficking. So it is important to recognize that more in-depth research is needed to better understand the correlation between climate change and gender-based violence, as climate change does not directly cause gender-based violence, and the way in which climate change impacts population also depends on socioeconomic factors, national legislations, and other conditions, which opens an opportunity to address these issues together as a way to build more resilient communities, both with climate change and gender-based violence. The next, please. We are going to talk a little bit about this research and this topic that we have been working, and many organizations have been working, is about the triple nexus and the links of vulnerability, the links between climate vulnerability, gender inequality, and state fragility. Because state fragility can also play a role in what we call this triple nexus. Under the agent partnership with USAID, we have also studied indicators on climate vulnerability, gender inequality, and state fragility. When overlying this data, the paper suggests that a statistical correlation exists between these issues. Results of this research will be presented in another webinar on May, so please stay tuned. This nexus should be at the center of international and national agendas, including climate change, gender-based violence, and women, peace and security agenda. As Vandana has explained us, this general recommendation number 37 is powerful for doing this. It's a general recommendation that states need to follow and need to inform how they are addressing this. So next, please. In IUCN, we have also, during the pandemic, do a research about how COVID is impacting, and the climate changes is compounded by the pandemic, rolling back gender equality and elevating gender differentiated risks for safety and resilience. It is not a news, everybody's talking about this, including they are saying the new pandemic is gender-based violence in the context of COVID. So these impacts of COVID have been magnified the pressures of many already stressed regions and communities, feeling the burden of more extreme and frequent weather-related disasters due to climate change. In addition to forcing many temporarily or permanently move or migrate, increasing the risk of COVID infections, compounded by vulnerabilities and stress caused by these two crises, are putting women and girls at a greater risk of multiple forms of gender-based violence, such as domestic violence, rape, and sexual exploitation and abuse. The increase of gender-based violence has already been documented. And for example, we can see that as climate change worsens food security and the pandemic closes schools, child marriage is rising in Afghanistan, Cameroon, India, South Sudan, and Yemen. We haven't seen this, we didn't found some data for other regions, but I'm sure there are, this is happening also in other regions like Latin America. These impacts also affect their resilience to this crisis and their capacity to be involved in adaptation and restoration efforts. We also found other examples on how COVID-19 has worsened gender-based violence in communities already affected by climate change in the IUCN information note that you can find in the handout box in the right panel of this platform. So recovery from the pandemic brings an opportunity for building back better, for building sustainable and resilient communities to health crisis, climate change, and other crises that we now are facing. And to do so, addressing gender-based violence is an imperative. So next, please, Laura. Thank you. So why all these matters? Why this is important for both environmental and gender practitioners? Understanding climate-driven gender-based violence is essential for solving the climate crisis and realizing rights. While women are the primary victims of gender-based violence, gender-based violence ultimately harms the well-being of the entire communities and ecosystems, reducing opportunities for conservation and sustainable livelihoods. Understanding how climatic stress affect patterns of gender-based violence can unlock communities' potential to adapt and to respond to a better climate change. That is why this matters. Climate change, disaster response, and gender-based violence and programming should be tailored to respond to this nexus, contributing to a more effective climate solutions as well as gender equality and women's empowerment. This is essential to meet all the SDGs and to eradicate poverty. Next, please. And the last. We named this seminar From Grassroots to Policies, and Vandana, in her last opening remark, she called us the attention to develop national policies, making these linkages, gender responsive policies, standards, safeguards, and protocols to prevent and to respond to gender-based violence in the context of climate change are urgent. And for that, organizational and political will is necessary. These tools need to respond, of course, to local contexts, including customary laws and policies. Including gender-based violence through the project cycle when we are developing, created new projects is also key, but it goes beyond just adding words in paper. There is a need to fund these interventions, and many environmental financial mechanisms are already requiring gender-based violence plans and protocols to prevent unintended gender-based violence risks. Therefore, there is a need, but also an opportunity to develop tools and build staff capacity to effectively integrate gender-based violence through the project cycle. We have learned from existing gender-based violence expertise, and we can engage with experts across other sectors. Building a cross-sectoral partnership has also proven to be a successful way to address gender-based violence in environmental programming. Finally, accountability mechanisms, as Vandana was also saying, are necessary to monitor progress towards addressing gender-based violence and environment linkages. I will finish my presentation saying that there are already international mandates, national policies, and projects addressing gender and climate change, and some of them, like some new round of national determined contribution to the UNFCCC, and the updated draft of the Gender Plan of Action of the Convention on Biological Diversity are starting to include gender-based violence as a cross-cutting issue. Additionally, through the Gender-Based Violence and Environment Linkages Center, we are working on the development of a gender-based violence and climate change brief and supporting IUCN projects in mainstreaming. Colleagues, we are aware of the importance of this, and the table is set. We need to sit together and start implementing what we have already known. So I'm finalizing this brief presentation, and Julia, the floor is yours. I'm looking forward to a very rich discussion with our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Itza. That was a really wonderful overview of the linkages between gender-based violence and climate change, and has really provided an excellent foundation for our discussion this morning or afternoon and evening for many. My name is Julia Bradley Cook. As Kate mentioned earlier, I am a climate change advisor in USAID's Bureau for Africa, and so I, on a day-to-day basis, am thinking about how to address climate change in our programs in sub-Saharan Africa, and also how to promote opportunities to mitigate climate change. So I'm very excited to have your words as context for this discussion, and have this important discussion to dive into why it matters, why the linkages between gender-based violence and climate change matter so much, and how we, from my perspective as a climate change advisor, other environmental experts, and beyond, what we should know from a variety of different perspectives. So we'll be hearing from our discussants during this presentation from a really rich range of perspectives. So first, we will do some introductions, and I would love the panelists to all come on video if possible. And we will, I'll introduce the panelists one by one and ask that the panelists please start by giving us 3 words to describe you. So first, I would like to introduce Josephine Chandiru, who works as a gender specialist under the NDC Support Project in UNDP Uganda. In addition, she supports all the gender streams of work under the Climate Change Disaster Risk Resilience Portfolio. So Josephine, what 3 words would you use to describe yourself, please?
I love the issues of women's empowerment and putting gender issues at the center of development. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Josephine. Next on our panelists, we have Jessica Huertas, who is the Cross-Cutting Approaches and Climate Change Coordinator at the Climate Change and Climate Change and Desertification Directorate General from the Ministry of Environment, Peru. She's a social psychologist with over 20 years of experience in social public policies, programs, and projects. Jessica has experience working with vulnerable and at-risk populations, as well as the mainstreaming of human rights, intercultural, intergenerational, and gender approaches throughout the project cycle in climate change programs and projects. She is also part of the team at the Ministry of Environment tasked with preliminary consultation on the regulations and framework law on climate change and desertification. Jessica, could you please share 3 words to describe yourself and add to that bio?
Yeah, of course. I think I'm dreamy, I'm persistent, and I'm critical thinking. Thank you.
Wonderful, great choices, thank you. Next, we have Dr. Jocelyn Kelly, who is the director of Harvard Humanitarian's Initiative Gender Rights and Resilience Program, where she designs and implements projects to examine issues related to gender, peace and security in fragile states. Dr. Kelly has been conducting health-related research using qualitative and quantitative research methods for over a decade in national and international settings. Dr. Kelly's work focuses on understanding, preventing gender-based violence and human trafficking in complex crises, with an emphasis on especially examining mechanisms for resilience in these settings. Important for this particular topic today, Dr. Kelly's current research interests include promoting and measuring gender-based violence risk mitigation in humanitarian emergencies, understanding the continuum of GBV before, during, and after humanitarian crises, and measuring and promoting social cohesion and community resilience as a pathway of reducing violence. Jocelyn, could you please provide 3 words to describe yourself?
Julia, I think one of those words is going to have to be wordy after hearing how long my bio was. But I will also add curious and enthusiastic and maybe hopeful as well.
Great. Add an extra word. That's great. I like it. Thank you so much. And finally, I'm very pleased to introduce Kavita Naidu, who is an international human rights lawyer from Fiji, Australia, working in feminist climate justice. She works with grassroots women in all their diversity from Asia and the Pacific to build feminist climate justice movement. Currently, Kavita is working as a consultant with Edith Cowan University and Plan International Australia on feminist participatory action research in Fiji and Kiribati. So Kavita, over to you. 3 words, please.
Thank you, Julia. I think the 3 words I'll use would be untamed, fierce, and hilarious. So I'm told.
Right. It's okay to, take other people's word for it. Thank you. So Kavita, I'll stick with you to kick off this conversation, please. And really want to dig into some of the issues and your perspective from the feminist climate justice movement work that you're doing. IUCN's research clearly brought together a huge amount of evidence across sectors and regions, piecing together a clear view that the risks and incidence of gender-based violence is escalating in the context of climate change. From your perspective and your experience at the grassroots level across Asia and the Pacific, my questions are, how do you see climate change impacting gender-based violence, and vice versa, gender-based violence impacting climate change? And then also, I'd love to hear, what are the challenges and opportunities and gaps, especially in relation to policies and commitment frameworks? Thank you.
Thanks, Julia. I think I'll begin by just setting in context the region that I'm specifically working in, which is Asia and Pacific. This is a region that's entrenched by patriarchy, cultural and religious norms, colonial legacies, and a neoliberal economic system, which all in combination subjugates women and girls from accessing basic human rights. So the system itself is designed to deliberately disadvantage and make vulnerable women and young girls, particularly the indigenous, the rural, the poor, women living with disabilities, gender non-binary, the elderly. So the women in this region are already suffering from epidemic levels of discrimination, inequality, and violence, which hinders their capacity to adapt or build climate resilience. And then for vice versa, how is GBV then, contributing towards the climate crisis? So women facing violence become disempowered to engage as active agents in participating in inclusive, gender-responsive climate action. And so in terms of the challenges, the biggest challenge, we find in our work is our current system. The system itself has really multiplied and exacerbated human rights violations, violence against women. And so, so we've got a collision of the climate crisis with the COVID, as Itzer has explained. And what it's done really, it's increased, for instance, the unpaid labor of domestic and care work of women. Women who are, facing lockdowns across the region are now facing increasing domestic violence and intimate partner violence in their homes. Women in this region make up a large majority of the informal work sector, and they've now been pushed into greater poverty because of, the implications of COVID-19 on the economy and so forth. So this is a huge challenge, because now we're facing colliding crises of climate and COVID. And then when I'm talking about the system, so the problem again in this region in terms of a huge challenge is the debt crisis that we're facing. This debt crisis has actually been a byproduct of the neoliberal economic system, driven by an international trade and investment system where profit is driven by exploiting the unpaid labor of women of color from the global south. Our entire economy is actually subsidized through, natural resource extraction and exploited labor of women from this region. And then the other major challenge that we also find is the indiscriminate attacks, murders, kidnappings, and assassinations of women, environment, and human rights defenders. And this is happening, through the collusion of our governments, the military, and corporations against these defenders, and they're acting with full impunity. These women do not have access to justice, protection, or redress. So these are some of the challenges that we're finding in this region that we need to really understand and tackle. In terms of opportunities, I'm a big advocate for feminist global Green New Deals, because this is a package that is really, looking at radically transforming our current system. It is, a package that really talks about gender justice, social justice, trade and economic justice. It's talking about environment justice. It's talking about just feminist climate solutions that would really challenge our racist, colonial, patriarchal, and capitalist systems. And so I think, if we can then question, are our trade agreements really promoting Indigenous and gender rights? Is clean energy or just and equitable transition going to replicate business as usual and extract natural resources and labor from the global south? Or are we looking at a global solution that's not going to replicate this system and actually work in terms of protecting human rights? And so this is something that we find to be, an opportunity for us to really examine and see, would a feminist global Green New Deal, I believe there's feminist Green New Deals coming from US, UK, I believe there is a decolonial global Green New Deal as well. And these are the ones that we're really looking at in terms of, would this provide the solutions that we're looking for? Just feminist solutions to tackling violence, climate crisis, and the multiple crises that we're facing right now. Did I miss a question?
Wonderful. No, that is superb. Thank you, Kavita. I am very curious. I see a lot of nodding from the other participants, the panelists. Are there other anything else that others on the panel would like to add in terms of grassroots level observations that, in addition to what Kavita has said and the challenges and solutions that she's putting forth at this point? All right, Jessica, did you want to say something or not? We can move to you next, actually, because so Kavita has laid out this really great perspective from the grassroots level. And so, Jessica, from your perspective, what you bring to this conversation is that from Peru, we see a lot of leadership in the development and implementation of gender responsive climate change commitments at the national level, including through the development of the National Climate Change Gender Action Plan, CCGAP, which IUCN helped to facilitate and USAID contributed to supporting. The CCGAP is also linked to the NDCs and other policy instruments. So a couple questions I have for you are, how have the national gender responsive climate change commitments like CCGAP created space to explore gender-based violence and climate change impacts? And then can you share your perspective on the challenges and opportunities in this space? Thank you.
Thank you. I want to change my language to English from Spanish because I'm more comfortable. So, creo que
I believe that one of the first things which will allow us to understand climate change and gender violence is the following. There is an interdependence amongst both, and we've forgotten them. You know, we work on environmental issues and we never realize that they're related to human issues. So, you know, gender violence and the incorporation is to understand this interdependence and this interdependence. Our lives are not possible if we do not take care of Earth, of Mother Earth. And something additional which is interesting, it allows us to break away from a myth that gender violence is only physical violence. It allows us to visibilize violence, a structural violence, for example, in our country. It generates poverty. From an energy standpoint, in women, it reduces their capabilities of being able to face climate change. Now, another example is that structural violence has pushed women not to be able to make decisions. For example, in the water chain, women on water topics, they expect water to reach their homes on their farmlands, but they're not included. In a study of last year, they reviewed that there are 125,000 women users of water. We're talking of a large number. Now, out of those 125,000 women, only 10% of women work in the water system, and only 0.9% women work in the water sewage system. So we can see that women can make no decisions on water. They have to search for water, to be able to use water, to manage water. So of course there is a big back. They have to carry out further jobs, further work now under this pandemic, simply to clean their hands, but they do not have any decision whatsoever concerning the management of water at high levels. And the structural violence is part of how gender violence is found all over. And of course, this definitely allows to clearly see these circumstances. And in women, there's much diversity and they suffer much vulnerable circumstances. For example, if a disaster takes place from an environmental perspective, a populational group, for example, has to relocate because they suffer. There are tents for women, for men, and what about trans women? They have to suffer double discrimination. They have nowhere to go in a very conservative country like ours. So climate change definitely allows us to look into all of these different areas, these situations, but also within populational group, there is diversity that needs to take place. And this is allowing us to see this information, why we are being able to go area by area with regards to
sobre violencia.
Gender violence, and we're starting to work on this and how it is that women is instrumentalized and is not compensated. So this is structural violence as well. So
it's important to have this cross-section between violence and climate change. We have to be aware of this, and we also understand that information is another factor. For example, during the last census in agriculture in our country, this goes back to 2012. It has been a long time. We don't know what's going on in agriculture. This is the base that is going to have the greatest impact due to climate change. So it's important to see all this when you start working with gender and climate change. And what are the challenges that we have before us? Well, truly many of them. I believe that the first challenge is going from what we call gender responsive policies, as they're called in English, to gender transformative policies. We can bet on this. We want to make sure that these gaps are visible. We want to transform them. And this implies starting to shift the way we think, that gender is only women. No, it's not only women. We have to work on a complete basis. For instance, when we see migration due to climate change, there's impact, a differentiated impact on men. When they migrate due to climate change, they don't go to a space of mental health to fight their depression, their feeling of being uprooted. Why? Because this is not viewed from a gender basis, including both genders. So we're not only talking about female empowerment, because sometimes what we do is that we give women even greater roles. Sometimes we get very excited and we give more work to women. It might be a nice project. For instance, we're talking about managing forests. We teach women how to use drones, and they do various things, but they don't only
work. They have to take care of the woods. They have to take care of their children. And there has been no social transformation and therefore no responsibilization. So I believe that we have to start this transformation. The second challenge is making sure that the gender focus is intersectional. You can't look at this issue without looking at the intercultural aspect. Women, based on our habits, our customs, our language, are going to express themselves differently. And now with the challenge that we have with climate change in Peru, this has been heavily accentuated. So we have to go from gender to a more intersectional focus, looking at the differences and looking at the possibilities. The last challenge I would like to mention is that this is a challenge with the pandemic. I believe that the pandemic has only made these gaps wider. COVID has created a very deep blow on Peru, so these gaps have become greater instead of becoming narrower. So let's try to see how we could start working together on the topic of gender and climate change in a country that has to figure out how it's going to survive the following day. Thank you.
Really done a phenomenal job of not only expanding the how we're thinking about violence in this conversation, but also the important interlinkages and how to take it on in these issues on within the context of national level water in the water sector, for instance. Jessica, I'm sorry, I will next turn to Josephine. Lots of J's here today. Josephine, UNDP has been one of the first international organizations, together with partners and with support from the Green Climate Fund, to recognize gender-based violence in the context of climate-related projects and to try to develop strategies to mitigate risk and realize rights. Can you tell us about the Wetlands Restoration Project and how gender-based violence considerations were integrated into this project? What was the strategy and approach for the work? And can you please share any relevant findings from the process, please?
Okay, thank you so much. UNDP is supporting government of Uganda to implement the Green Climate Fund project, which is entitled Building Communities, Resilient Communities, Wetland Ecosystems, and Associated Catchments in Uganda. The implementation modality is, of course, direct implementation by the government, and this project is being implemented in 3 line ministries: Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Water and Environment, and of course, the Uganda National Meteorology Authority. This project has 3 key
Jessica, or Josephine, are you still speaking? I can't hear you right now.
Sorry.
Okay.
I had a network issue. Yeah, sorry.
So you were talking about the 3 elements of the project.
Yes. So the 3 elements of the project: one is the restoration management of wetland hydrology and associated catchment, which is managed by the Ministry of Water and Environment. And this is the process of restoring the wetlands and the catchment. And during this process, actually, the communities are convinced to get out of the wetlands such that they can restore the wetlands. And component 2 deals with improved agricultural practices and alternative livelihoods. That is to ensure that the communities that have been gotten out of the wetland, as they're restoring the wetlands, are given alternative livelihoods and improved agricultural practices such that we do not degrade the environment again and restore the wetlands. And then we have component 3, and component 2 is being managed by the Ministry of Agriculture. Then component 3 deals with the issues of strengthening access to climate information and early warning information to farmers in the wetland region and at the catchments. And this is being managed by UNMA. And this helps the farmers to know the climate information so that they can actually manage their farming and alternative livelihoods better. And so what does the pilot do? We have the GBV pilot is in 2 districts. This overall project is in 24 districts of Uganda, and it's in the western region and the eastern region. But this pilot is done in 2 districts. One is in eastern, which is Palisa, and one is in the western, which is Busenyi. And so the pilot is actually being implemented by a civil society organization called CEDOVIP, Center for Domestic Violence. And the objective of this pilot is to address GBV through the targeted interventions to ensure that the climate actions do not put more harm on the communities, on women, and have GBV at that level. And so how have we managed to integrate GBV in the process? One, what we did was to conduct affirmative research to actually understand the GBV issues in these 2 districts. What is really happening on ground, the interlinkage between GBV and climate change. And so the finding actually clearly highlighted that climate change may actually exacerbate the existing gender inequalities and unequal power relations, and also increase the probability for the women and girls to experience more violence. And therefore, it was agreed that the project implementation should actually ensure that they integrate best practices in addressing GBV throughout the project to ensure that we use evidence-based to mitigate and the GBV and have a proper plan to do that. And also, it was realized that the gender-blind livelihood activities were likely to reinforce the male-dominant positions in the areas. You must know that Uganda is a patriarchal society. Land belongs to the men, and we may only access men through I mean land through the men. There are very few who own land, those who can afford to buy. And so that if we use gender blind programming for the livelihood options, then the implication is that then the men will take all these options and then the women will not benefit from it. Actually, it can also increase more GBV at that end. And so how did we continued to what the first step we actually did after conducting the formative research and having this with the government partners, we had to build partnership with the national and the district local governments. This is to ensure that they appreciate the issues of GBV programming in the wetland sector. You know that wetland sector is the non-traditional gender and GBV area, and they were actually agreeing about GBV and will take long to appreciate why GBV has to be part and parcel of this project. So we had to first build partnership, and after that, we then developed customized tools and materials for GBV prevention activities. And then we developed a GBV mitigation risk plan for the project. And then we also developed a GBV checklist for the project, for the overall project. Actually, along the way, when we're doing too, we realized that as we discuss with the government partners, it's very important as the other 22 districts, as they are doing these activities of wetland restoration, component 2 of alternative livelihoods, information to climate access, they ought to ensure that as they go out, they do no more harm. So we developed a GBV checklist to ensure that the activities do not exacerbate GBV. And of course, then we build the capacity, and we are still building the capacity of the component heads and the people who are working on this pilot, on the whole project. And so we also identified and pursue livelihood options which do not perpetuate GB inequalities. We also had to develop a livelihood plan that is gender responsive to ensure that the livelihood options are addressing the needs of men and women in those localities. We are not choosing the crops that are male dominated. We are only not choosing the crops that are female dominated. We are having a consensus in terms of when they are selecting these crops and alternative livelihoods. And also we had to integrate the gender transformative measures for the livelihood component personnel, so that when they go, they understand these issues. And of course, it is work in progress. And then the issue of strengthening the community-based prevention structures, we have selected some 60 community facilitators, but GBV came, COVID, with COVID on the lockdown, we haven't done so much work at the grassroots level with the communities directly. We've been working with the technical staff, both at the national level and at the district level. So what has been our strategy? The strategy is capacity needs assessment. We had to have a capacity needs assessment to get to understand the needs of the capacity of the implementing partners. Where are they? With the linkages between gender and GBV, and what best training can be designed for them. And of course, we designed the training tools for them on GBV and climate change, and capacity building for both the implementers at the district and the national level. And then we developed the GBV risk mitigation plan, which is a plan that we are going to start to actually implement. We have developed a checklist that has been given to them, and we discuss it to them. And the GBV mitigation plan we developed with them as together. They had to do the reviews, they had to adapt it and agree to it. That is to build consensus with the government and the people working around the project. And so what are the relevant findings that we have found along the way as we are programming GBV and climate change in the wetland project? Strengthening capacity of both the national and district on GBV and climate change nexus is very, very important. And of course, it's not a one-off. It has to be continuous, and we have to continuously build their skills, because you cannot just build a skill in one day, in 1 year. It has to be a continuous thing. So we normally try our best to do at least twice in a year or 3 times to ensure that we get new ideas and new areas that they really need their capacity to be strengthened. And of course, having affirmative research really offered create linkages between GBV and climate change impact, that we could show the results to the partners to appreciate the importance of GBV programming. And of course, having a plan for GBV mitigation is very, very important, because then the plan guides the direction of the implementation. And so thank you. I hope I've answered all your questions, Julia. Over to you.
Wonderful. That is just a really great way to understand the details of how GBV plugs into the specifics of a project that is not, hasn't been conventionally aligned with GBV. So both from the details of the interventions to additional ways to take on this issue. So thank you very much, Josephine, for that. Last but not least, certainly, Jocelyn, I would like to talk to you now about GBV in the context of the humanitarian sector. And GBV has long been a priority in the humanitarian sector, and there are already many tools and approaches available that we can learn from in the context of climate change. So addressing climate change is now an emergency issue. So all of these things are coming together and colliding, as many have said already. So my questions are, what must climate decision makers and practitioners know and consider, especially drawing on expertise from other sectors like the humanitarian sector? And what does the RISE effort contribute? If you could talk about that, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So Julia, as you noted, I come from the humanitarian field, and now we all can acknowledge that climate change is an emergency. It's a humanitarian emergency and it's a human rights emergency. And I think Josephine's comments about her project and how they really created these remarkable tools to help everyone understand the gender dimensions of the projects at whatever level they were is one of the things that I really wanted to highlight in the learning that we have from the humanitarian field, which, as many of you know, has 13 individual sectors and growing. And so that doesn't mean that every person who specializes in water and sanitation, or every person who specializes in camp management needs to be an absolutely perfect GBV specialist. No, in fact, you don't have to specialize in GBV to include the voices of women and girls in environmental program design, program adaptation, or program leadership. And I think all of the previous speakers really highlighted that, that we can make sure that the voices of women and girls are part of the tapestry of how we create programs, rather than some kind of add-on or some kind of, second thought. The humanitarian field, I think we should all acknowledge, is not perfect, but there are years of learning to support non-GBV specialists on how to draw on local expertise and international expertise. There's knowledge, there's tools, and there's tools being created every day, as we just learned, to ensure that women and girls first are not exposed to increased risk as a result of environmental programming. And secondly, to ensure that women and girls have the leadership role in the programming. So this was a hard fought and hard won lesson from humanitarian programming, that women and girls are actually already the experts in exactly what we're trying to understand. And leveraging that expertise, leveraging that knowledge, means that we're better at environmental early warning, we're better at environmental adaptation, innovation, and response. Women and girls are already doing this, communities are already doing this. So we as a community really need to kind of put on our listening hats, develop the tools to make sure that we are attuned to understanding what communities know and taking it from there. So, just to state the obvious, without leveraging this expertise, we're choosing to leave half of the globe's voice on the table and half of the globe's knowledge and innovation on the table. Secondly, I think I'd like to highlight that there are really intriguing links looking at the harms perpetrated on people within communities and the harms done to the environment. So you mentioned the RISE program, and we were really lucky at my organization to be part of a consortium led by local Congolese women's human rights leaders, and they're developing a curriculum that really supports empathy and understanding and a sense of interconnectedness in the mining communities where they work. And as many of you know, mining communities are among the most precarious, challenging, and exploitative environments in the world. These women have come up with ways to emphasize not only that there are connections among people within the community, so between women and men, between youth and the elderly, but also between people and their place and their environment, and the environment upon which they rely to make a living, and the environment that they hope to pass on to their children. So this curriculum is being rigorously tested, and hopefully will help build this critical evidence base that IUCN has pioneered, where we understand the best ways to see and then kind of prevent linkages between GBV and climate change, but beyond just preventing GBV, to really support kind of women's leadership and this understanding of empathy and interconnectedness. And third, you know, just a call to say that we should always be looking at both sides of the coin. So not only risk, but also resilience. And in some work I'm doing in Central Africa and Northern Congo, we're beginning to understand and measure and support resilience as it's seen in those local communities. And when we do that, we see clear linkages between individual resilience, community resilience, and pro-environmental behaviors. So stronger people make stronger environments. And I think kind of the last thought that I would kind of leave the group with is that it took the humanitarian field years to begin to understand the multivariate ways that women are affected by and can affect humanitarian programming. And the hard-learned lessons about how to elevate the voices of women and girls and men and boys, I would say let us take that as that highest learning as the floor upon which we can now build our increased understanding of the linkages between gender and climate change.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jocelyn. Really wonderful. I have learned so much from all of these opening remarks from all of you all. So thank you so much for sharing. We're getting a lot of great questions from our audience. And one that I would like to start with is about COVID, which has come up a few times here, and the collision of COVID and climate change crises, and how gender-based violence is linked to that. So for any of you, whoever wants to take this on, are you optimistic for COVID recovery strategies, or that COVID recovery strategies are appreciating and addressing the gendered impacts on women? If so, could these strategies pave the way for further appreciation of and work on gender-based violence and environment links? Or is there anything in that realm that you would really advocate for and like to see? Would anyone like to take that on? Kavita, please. Thank you. I think you're still on mute, Kavita. Do you see the little orange microphone button? Would anyone else, while Kavita is trying to find her mute button, want to chime in about the COVID recovery? Jocelyn, or sorry, Josephine?
Yeah, sure. COVID-19, especially in Uganda, really exposed the level of GBV, especially intimate partner violence at the household level. During the lockdown, we had a very high spike of GBV at a rate that we did not actually ever expect. And so it has really opened our eyes that the recovery of COVID has to make sure GBV and gender mainstreaming is at the heart of development if we were to protect the rights of women and girls in Uganda. And so it's really important. And of course, connecting it to the climate nexus and the crisis to make sure that all these programs ensure that they mainstream GBV, mainstream gender and women's empowerment, to ensure that we have benefits for the whole society approach and do not leave no one behind in the programming. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Josephine. Kavita, do you have your microphone set?
Yes, I think it's working now. Okay, so sorry about that earlier. Different governments around the world are taking different measures for the post-pandemic recovery. Civil society across the globe is really joining efforts in like really demanding that the post-pandemic recovery be one that's based on a care economy, that's regenerative, that's sustainable, that protects human rights, that protects indigenous knowledge and traditional systems, is based on gender justice, And the way that we're actually doing this work is we're pulling in our own resources at the global level to build solidarity and momentum behind advancing an alternative economy to the one that we've got at the moment. Because again, as I said, the root causes of our current crises happens to just be the system that we're all trapped in. And so we're using COVID and, you know, the urgency of the climate crisis to really now demand action that radically transforms this system. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Yes, and I would say we're trying to figure that out on the climate change realm as well, in terms of how to fold in decarbonized energy systems and resilience into the recovery, so that we can this transformation can be a holistic one. We have a couple, what I would say, just one more minute really, but so clearly there's so much more that we can explore and lots of rich questions that have come in. Jessica or Jocelyn, I would invite you to share one final comment, that last takeaway that you would add to the discussion before we close. Jessica, do you have one last takeaway, please? Thank you.
Yes, please. Vi una pregunta sobre cómo es el tema de financiamiento.
I saw a question on financing of gender and climate change. We have to be very critical from international cooperation. What we promote is that there are the variables, gender variables in the projects, but the question is not asked. What is the specific balance, the specific amount for that inclusion? So I think that it would be interesting to see that there is a promotion on an international level, but we don't close the circle. We have a gender variable. How do we monitor it? What kind of information are we providing? What is being done? We don't have that kind of data. So I believe that this is something that has to be repaired, especially during the pandemic. We have to have affirmative action for women to participate. We have to bring all this together. For instance, an internet connection. Many women don't have an internet connection. We don't have a computer. We have computers, but many women don't. If they have the computer, they don't know how to use it, perhaps. So when a project says, I want to have a gender dimension, we're not talking about a narrative only. We have to talk about the funds. What is going to be spent on this? Then we have to provide the best practices to see if this is something favorable. This is something that is lacking in GBV and climate change. That was my last message.
Jocelyn, was there a final message you wanted to leave us with?
Yeah, just really quickly, maybe stitching together some of the points from the other panelists. I think, bringing out the challenge of the COVID pandemic has really highlighted that kind of we as a world have just experienced one of the first shared acute emergencies. And I think if we are able to take that as a wake-up call, that we understand, yes, that the pandemic laid bare these fissures and vulnerabilities that affected everyone differently, but I think we all felt suddenly fragile and vulnerable to an emergency that we were completely unprepared for. And frankly, that's exactly what climate change is. And so if we can leverage this moment, this understanding that we can't wait any longer, now is the time to act. We have a remarkable interconnected globe. We need to include women who are still kind of falling in the digital divide. But if we do that, if we can address this pandemic, then we can also address the challenge of climate change, especially by linking the two together.
Beautiful. Wow. Well, I am so glad that we have the expertise of this panel to draw on as we take on that challenge. So thank you all for sharing your really hard-earned wisdom and expertise and very rich perspectives. I have learned so much. I'm sure all of our audience has as well. And so really, I'm so grateful that you were able to join and share your perspectives. With that, I will turn it over to Kate. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I was thinking as I was listening to you, it's a bit audacious really to think that we could tackle this topic in just an hour and a half, but you each raised such brilliant points. And on behalf of all of us, our collaborators, the friends over on the USAID side, I really want to thank each and every one of you for your time. Thank you to the audience. Thank you to USAID. Thank you to all of our organizations here who are joining hands on making this session happen as collaborators here. There's a last closing poll on your screen. It has been a very rich hour and a half, and we simply want to know if you feel you've learned anything, and in particular, anything you think you can take with you into the rest of your workday here, or for many of you, it's very late at night. So what will you wake up thinking about tomorrow? Thank you so much for giving us just 30 seconds more of your time to answer this question. We're going to leave this open as I see people are starting to sign off. Let me add my sincere thanks to each and every one of you once again. And I'll remind you that this recording will be available. All of the tools that were mentioned actually in this session, including from the speakers, we'll make sure these are available on our website. Thank you so much. That's great feedback. We very much appreciate that, and I'm sure our speakers do as well. There were also a lot of questions submitted today, and we really, really appreciate that. We will think about how we can respond to some of those. We invite you to reach to us directly, in particular if you're in need of specific guidance and support ASAP. We will do our best to get back to you and direct you to some resources that can help. Please visit our website. Feel free to reach out to us. And we really look forward to seeing you next time. This is a webinar series that's organized roughly quarterly, sometimes more frequently, because there's a lot of information to talk about and strategies to develop together. Thank you so much. Have a great day and a lovely evening. Thanks to all.
Thank you.
Take good care.
Bye.
Thank you.